dear audience members from all over the world, all over Europe. This is a seminar about change, right? You're focusing very much on how you actually define change that we as academics can use. I would actually define change as a reimagining of the real.
This term of reimagination is a nice term, but I think we should fill it with some more content.
I think this is a very difficult question to give an answer to in a very general way. Depends on what kind of change we are talking about, social change or change in the development sector or political change, economic change.
But how do you guys see change if you sort of position yourself as a communication and media scholar?
Change is evaluated in very different ways. We define change sometimes as improvement, integrated into dreams or fantasies of how we imagine a better world. This implies the problematization of the present.
To a certain degree, at least, in order to mobilize resources to reconfigure the future.
Of course, these improvements can be situated at a diversity of micro-levels. For instance, in a particular social relation, or at the macro level, focusing on the progression of society towards a particular utopia, often characterized by the overdetermined omnipresence of an assemblage of values.
In utopias, the direction and intensity of this benevolent progression, but also the nature of the values to be radically implemented, are not pre-given though. They are object of societal struggle.
Even the utopias themselves vary considerably.
With white supremacism and its fantasy of racial homogeneity, collectivism and its fantasy of social justice,
and ecocentrism and its fantasy of harmonious relations with Gaia, all coexisting in particular times and spaces.
Sometimes these discursive struggles also contain positions that articulate change as undesirable and considered malevolent at a particular level or in general.
Change then triggers a sense of discomfort.
And loss. It becomes a threat that needs to be prevented, halted, or reversed. At a more general level, we can find conservative ideologies resisting societal change at a broader level.
But we can also find more particular dystopian projects. For instance, trying to counter the changes brought about by new technologies or new empowerments.
Change can have very different scale, sometimes only having a limited effect, but in other cases, change can have a global impact. This also implies a different balance between change and continuity, with small-scale changes not touching upon the many other continuities of everyday life, and often remaining invisible to others. Everyday life consists out of an immense set of variations, but they remain sometimes disconnected from the multitude of other events and experiences, so that no structural patterns emerge. But societies are characterized by hegemonies and structural stabilities that are not easy to change, and which are sometimes labeled as part of the status quo. Marxist and other left-wing thinkers have, for instance, a long tradition of critiquing the not structurally changing differences in access to resources, and in particular to economic capital, even though the option of revolutionary change is very much part of these theories. Behind this argumentation, we can find the idea that societal rigidity and inelasticity is considerable, and structural change requires intense and sometimes violent mobilization. Nevertheless, as Foucault has argued in his archaeogenealogical analysis on punishment and sexuality, hegemonies can be disrupted and altered over time, even without violent revolutions. Of course, scale, intensity, and visibility are not necessarily automatically connected. For instance, small-scale changes, such as the loss of a family member or friend, might have tremendous and long-lasting impact on those involved, while more structural changes might affect many, but only in very limited ways. Structural change might occur only very slow, and their patterns may remain invisible to many. Still, in many cases, the three components of scale, intensity, and visibility become aligned, reinforcing each other.
When we discuss change, we often have a tendency of focusing on the novelty it brings. Stability and continuity, in contrast, are often taken for granted and not seen as worthy of our attention. Sometimes this myopia blinds us for structural stabilities, drawing our attention with an almost hypnotic strength to superfluous change. Theories on the hyperreal, for instance, as developed by Baudrillard, critique these disconnecting logics of overstimulation that are driven by minimal variations, for instance, as produced by the culture industry, as the authors work in the tradition of the Frankfurt School would argue. Of course, in some cases, a semi-exclusive focus on particular changes remains instrumental and even necessary from a political analytical perspective. This temporary suspension of interrelationality enables and produces a capacity to better understand particular changes, articulating the coexisting stabilities and continuities as context. It also allows us to take the always different logics of a particular field, whether it concerns media or agriculture or activism or the legal field or the medical field or academia, into consideration, which sharpens our analytical gaze. Nevertheless, change is intimately connected with stability and continuity as they are mutually dependent. Without stability, we will not be able to define change. But change and stability continuity also coexist and overlap, as not everything is changing all the time, and all change integrates some degree of stability continuity, and vice versa.
The dimension of control refers to the human ability to organize and coordinate change, but also to channel and master change and the impact it has. Policy, for instance, is in many cases aimed at organizing change through legislative work, but also by providing resources to particular initiatives that are deemed important engines for change. But also other actors, for example, civil society actors, academics, and companies can initiate change through the production and circulation of ideas and objects and the mobilization of people. When change is more accidental, coincidental, or organic, generated by an unpredictable interplay of forces, natural or human or both, human individuals and organizations can still respond to these changes, again trying to channel and control them, moving from the position of object of change to subjects that are in control. We should be careful not to overestimate the human capacity to control complex processes, as we sometimes see being assumed in solutionist ideologies. Unintended consequences of interventions, counteractions driven by contestations, and human limitations in general are all elements that limit the human capacity to control processes on the planet, whether this is related to humans, non-human beings, or natural phenomena.
Change is defined as differences over time, which renders time very much part of this discussion. But there is not one time or one privileged moment to fixate the analysis of change. We can approach change from a short-term perspective or an event-focused perspective. However important these moment-based analyses are, they are grounded in particular temporal reference points, which renders the outcomes of these reflections on change specific. Still, for instance, in moments of crisis, which are per definition restricted in time, change can be radically confined to a particular time frame. At the same time, even these momentarily restricted changes are often embedded in larger and more structural patterns of change. The French Annales school, operating in the field of historical research, with Fernand Braudel as one of its main representatives, for instance, argues in favor of a long duration or longue durée approach, moving away from a focus on historical events. In our reflection about change, we do not want to impose a strong preference for one of these approaches simply because together they demonstrate the existence of different time frames when trying to understand change.
I would like to thank you all for the stimulating presentations and discussions around change and the impossibility to define change, right?
And of course, that was also for us a way to think about change. What I think this series of discussions brought out is the entanglement between similarities and differences over time.